Some men retire from flying, others never really land. Harrison Ford hadn't touched a rescue chopper in years, but on one storm-soaked morning in the mountains, a name crackled through the radio: James Ray. And just like that, the past wasn't the past anymore. It was a promise, unfinished and still waiting to be kept. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if stories like this speak to you, make sure to subscribe. Thunder Ridge didn't get storms often, but when it did, the sky didn't bother with warnings. Clouds had begun crawling over the ridgelines before sunrise, low and heavy, like they knew something the radar didn't. The wind scraped dust across the tarmac. Helicopter blades sat still, folded like sleeping vultures. Inside the main dining hall, the cadets were unusually quiet for a Wednesday. Someone nodded toward the far corner of the room. "That's him, right, Harrison Ford." Another cadet whispered. "He flew rescue ops in Nepal, got dropped into a gorge with no exit, got everyone out too. He's just here as a guest. Commander West brought him in for a training rotation. 3 weeks, they said. And today's his last day." Ford didn't look up. He sipped his coffee, black and bitter. The mug was chipped. He wore a plain gray shirt tucked into flight trousers, older than most of the cadets. No insignia, no rank patch, just a small scar above his temple that caught the light every time he turned toward the window. He wasn't listening. Or at least he didn't seem to be, until one name echoed across the room. "Pilot was James Ray," said a voice from the comms room. Transport bird went dark over Sector Echo, 30 miles out. Last ping had them skimming the tree line. Ford's eyes lifted. Slowly, deliberately, in the ops room sirens didn't blare, no chaos. Just a fast, tight gathering of officers and flight strategists hunched over a map blinking with red. The storm was tracking harder than expected, shifting south, with wind speeds rising past what most birds could handle. No satellite confirmation, no rescue team deployed, too risky. Ryder, one of the younger instructors, stepped forward. Cocky posture, confident tone. "No one's going out in that. With all due respect, sir, this isn't a Marvel movie. We don't send people into meat grinders on hope." A few others murmured agreement, cold logic, no emotion. West stood at the far end, arms folded. The years showed in the way he exhaled. Slow, tired. He'd flown that airspace himself once. He knew the drop zones, the false valleys, the wind tunnels no satellite could predict. Outside the hall, Ford walked past the line of lockers. His boots echoed softly on the concrete. One cadet stepped aside. James Ray. That name wasn't just a name. That was a student. That was a kid who sat in the 4th row, asked the questions no one else dared to, and once stalled a simulator because he wanted to feel what it's like to fall before you fly. Ford remembered something James had said after his first solo night mission, shivering, eyes wide, hands still trembling. "If anything ever happens to me up there, I hope you're the one they send." Ford didn't say anything that day, just nodded. Now, as the sky darkened over Thunder Ridge and the clouds began to gather with purpose, Ford stood still, just long enough for the wind to catch the edge of his collar. He didn't say a word, but something in his eyes shifted, like a door opened somewhere behind them. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. The storm wasn't waiting, and neither was he. The command room buzzed with clipped voices, scattered maps, and blinking screens. Rain was streaking the windows now, sideways and fast, like the storm had picked up a knife. A red circle pulsed on the monitor, Sector Echo. Still no contact, still no signal. The words no one's saying yet were already in the air. "He's gone," someone muttered. "We don't know that," said another, but the silence that followed agreed. Lieutenant Ryder stood at the head of the table, tall and tense, pacing like someone trying to outrun indecision. "Look, I know what you're all thinking," he said, "but this isn't going to be some miracle recovery mission. Visibility's 0, winds are rising, and we're not sending anyone into that meat grinder. Not unless we want to lose a second bird." Some nodded, others looked down, no one spoke up. And then quietly but undeniably, Harrison Ford stepped through the door. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just walked in like someone who used to belong there. The room noticed. Some turned, others froze. Ford walked past the screens, the blinking lights, the wall of muttered protocol, and stopped at the edge of the table. "I'll go," he said. The room stopped. Ryder blinked. "Excuse me." Ford didn't repeat himself. Ryder looked him over, grey shirt, no rank badge, boots still dusty from the tarmac. "You're serious," he said flatly. "You're really gonna volunteer for this? No crew, no support, no co-pilot." Ford nodded once. "I'm not letting that kid die out there alone." A beat of silence. Ryder let out a soft laugh, more disbelief than humor. "With all due respect, sir, we need a pilot, not a museum piece." Someone flinched. No one laughed. Ford's face didn't change. He didn't bite back, just stood still, gaze steady, and then West spoke. He hadn't said a word until now, just stood behind the others, arms crossed, listening. When he stepped forward, the room shifted, the way it does when authority doesn't have to raise its voice. "If anyone here thinks Harrison Ford isn't qualified," West said calmly, "feel free to check the logbook hanging in Hangar 3. The Bell 412 out there, still registered under his name. Still certified under emergency protocol." No one moved. West turned to Ford, voice lower now. "You really want to do this?" Ford looked him in the eye. "He's one of mine." West didn't argue, he just nodded. And in that nod was something heavier than orders. It was memory, it was respect. It was the quiet understanding between two men who had seen the worst and still chose to fly into it. No one questioned him after that. Because when the last man volunteers, you let him. The rain came down steady now, cold and sharp, washing the dust from the rooftops and turning the flight line into a slick mirror of mud and concrete. In Hangar 3, the lights buzzed low, flickering slightly with each roll of thunder in the distance. The Bell 412 sat in the far corner, tucked between shelving units and forgotten checklists, its olive-drab paint dulled by time, rotor blades bowed like an old fighter's shoulders. Most cadets thought it was decommissioned, most never gave it a second glance. Harrison Ford moved around it like a man greeting an old friend. His hand traced the edge of the side panel. He popped the latch, tested the hinges. Reached up, wiped a sleeve across the main windshield. The glass squeaked. The years hadn't been kind, but the bones were still there. Still true. He opened the engine hatch, checked fluid levels, ran fingers across each hydraulic line like a surgeon touching scar tissue. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached, not hurried, not afraid, just deliberate. Cadet Lee didn't say a word at first. He carried a metal toolbox under one arm and a flashlight clipped to his collar. Rain dripped from his sleeves. "I recalibrated the cabin gyros last week," he said softly. "They still hold alignment under 60 knots. Above that, might drift." Ford nodded, noted. Lee hesitated, then stepped closer, lifting a panel. "You flying solo?" Ford didn't answer immediately. He just glanced at the empty co-pilot seat. Then, "This bird was built for two, but sometimes one has to do." Lee swallowed hard. "I'll check the tail rotor." They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes. Tools clicked. Panels opened, closed. Wires were inspected, wiped down. At one point, the hangar door groaned against the wind and Cadet Lee flinched. Ford didn't. When they finished, Lee straightened and wiped his hands on his uniform. Ford pulled something from the inner pocket of his jacket, a small folded envelope. He held it out. Lee hesitated. "What's this?" Ford looked him in the eye. "Open it only if I don't come back." Lee took it slowly. The envelope was thick. The handwriting on the front, block letters, firm strokes, "To Command, Thunder Ridge." The weight of it hit differently, like it already knew what it was for. Ford didn't say anything else. He turned back to the bird, climbed into the cabin, and began flipping switches. The system hummed to life. Dials flickered. For a moment, it looked like the machine itself was waking up from a long sleep, blinking into the storm. West appeared at the hangar entrance, his coat soaked through, cap in hand. "You weren't supposed to be here for this," he said. Ford kept working, adjusting the collective. "Wasn't planning to be. I brought you in to teach, to pass it on, that's all." Ford stopped, looked over his shoulder. His face was calm, almost tired. "The teaching part's done," he said. "What's left doesn't fit in a syllabus." West stepped inside, boots echoing on the concrete. "There's a difference between bravery and unfinished business." Ford looked at him. Sometimes they're the same thing. West didn't argue. Ford turned back, reaching behind the co-pilot's seat. He pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Unfolded, it revealed a photograph, faded, weather-stained, edges curled. Three men stood side by side in flight gear, squinting into the sun. One was West, one was younger Ford. The third, James Ray, fresh out of school, smile wide and stupid, like the sky owed him something. Ford stared at the photo for a long moment, then tucked it into a pocket above his heart. "I told that kid if he ever went down," he said quietly, "I'd be the one who came back for him." West nodded once. "Then don't make me write that letter." Ford didn't answer, but the helicopter blades began to turn. The Bell 412 rose into the wind like it remembered how. Rotors chopped the air with defiance, slicing through sheets of rain and the kind of sky that made birds take shelter. From the tower, the aircraft looked like a stubborn dot, clawing against a storm that had already decided to win. Cadet stood behind the radar screen, arms folded, breath held. The signal blinked, then flickered, then blinked again. Inside the cockpit, Harrison Ford gripped the cyclic with one hand, the other steady on the throttle. The vibrations of the old machine thrummed through his spine like an old song. His eyes scanned the horizon, what little there was of it. Cloud banks rolled in like mountains made of smoke, and the wind hit the windshield in sudden, uneven bursts, the kind that shoved, not whispered. The radio crackled. "Echo 9, this is command. Ford, do you copy?" He didn't answer, not yet. Static swirled. Then came the voice, measured, familiar, heavy with memory. "Harry, don't do this again." A pause, then West's voice, quieter. "Nepal nearly took us both. You remember that gorge. You remember the way out. But there's no one to pull you back this time." In the cockpit, Ford adjusted altitude slightly. The rain slid sideways across the glass, relentless. He didn't touch the radio. West's voice softened even more. "I brought you in to pass on what you know, not to fly into a grave trying to keep a promise made 17 years ago." Ford's hand hovered near the switch. For a second, maybe less, his eyes flickered, not fear, not doubt, just reflection. Then he clicked the radio off. Silence. In the control room, West stared at the blank screen, listening to static. "He cut the line," someone said, stunned. West didn't move. No, he made a decision. Back in the air, the Bell 412 rocked hard as an updraft punched the underside. Ford corrected with muscle memory older than some of the bolts in the cockpit. He breathed through his nose, shallow and calm. The altimeter dipped, corrected. The airspeed gauge blinked yellow, warnings flared. He ignored all of them. It wasn't stubbornness. It was clarity. Below, trees bent like they were praying. Fog crawled up the cliffs like smoke looking for a way out. The terrain narrowed into a jagged canyon, and the GPS stuttered, then froze. Ford switched to visual, what little he had. A flicker of movement to the west, a dark smear against the rocks. Then, the red light on the radar screen at Thunder Ridge blinked once more, then it vanished. The room froze. A tech leaned forward. "Signal lost. Final ping, 07 nautical miles from crash coordinates." No one said it, but everyone felt it. He had almost made it. Almost. West exhaled, slow and bitter. He turned to the radar officer. "Try backup frequency." "We already did." "Try again." In the hangar, Cadet Lee stepped back from the monitor, lips parted, fingers curling into fists. "He's not gone," Lee whispered. "He can't be." But the screen remained dark. In the air above the tree line, through wind and rain and silence, a single helicopter flew on. No radio, no radar, no margin, just a promise, and a man keeping it. The canyon cut deep into the earth like an old scar that never healed. Jagged walls rose on either side, slick with rain, as if the rocks themselves were sweating. Lightning cracked the sky in violent white arcs, flashing across the broken frame of the downed transport. The aircraft had hit hard, its nose buried into the slope, tail twisted sideways like a broken limb. One engine still smoked. The smell of fuel hung thick in the wet air. Inside the wreckage, two men were alive. Barely. The first, a crew chief named Vickers, had managed to crawl free of the cabin. His leg was broken, and his face was streaked with soot, but he was breathing. He lay under a crooked pine, half-conscious, whispering prayers he couldn't remember learning. The second, James Ray, was still strapped into the pilot's seat. The impact had crumpled the forward section around him. Metal struts jutted in through the dash. His helmet was gone. Blood dripped from his ear onto the floor panel. He didn't move. Above the canyon, the wind roared like something alive. Then a new sound broke through it. Blades, the whop-whop-whop of rotors struggling against the storm. Trees bent. Dust and water spiraled upward in a tornado of motion as the Bell 412 descended, nose tilted, fighting the wind like a bull against the reins. It didn't land. There was no flat ground to land. Instead, it hovered, steady as the hands inside holding it. Harrison Ford dropped the side latch and leaned out, wind lashing against his face. He threw the first rescue rope down toward Vickers. The man below didn't react. Ford didn't wait. He clipped his harness, lowered himself halfway, and guided the rope down by hand. Rain whipped across his arms, cold and sharp. He reached the ground, squatted beside Vickers, checked his pulse, tightened the loop under his arms, and signaled upward. The helicopter bobbed, strained, but held. The winch lifted Vickers slowly, swinging against the canyon wall once before clearing it. Ford didn't go up with him. He turned to the wreck. Smoke hissed out of broken metal. The slope was unstable. Every footstep sent mud sliding. He climbed through the side hatch of the transport, crouched low, flashlight flicking. Inside, it was like crawling through a shattered ribcage. Wires hung. Rain dripped through a tear in the roof. Then he saw James, pinned. A steel bar had collapsed across his legs, and the entire control console had shifted forward, trapping his torso. His eyes were shut. His chest barely moved. Ford ducked lower. "James, can you hear me?" "Nothing." He pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. Weak pulse. Still there, still fighting. He looked at the bar, wedged in by pressure and twisted frame. No leverage, no angle, no help, just him. Ford braced both feet, grabbed the edge of the bar with both hands and pulled. Nothing. The metal groaned but didn't give. He adjusted, tried again. Still no movement. His breath came heavier now, throat burning. He repositioned, grit clenching between his teeth, and heaved. Something shifted. Then it slipped back. He grunted, shifted his weight, and pulled again, this time with everything. The old muscles in his shoulders screamed. A sharp crack rang out, followed by the sting of metal snapping. The bar moved, an inch, then another. Finally, just enough. He reached in, slid an arm behind James, and began dragging him out inch by inch. A shard of frame scraped across his scalp. Blood ran down the side of his face, dripping onto the boy's flight suit. Ford didn't stop. He kept pulling until James was clear. Outside, the storm raged harder. The winch lines swayed in the wind like a snake in panic. Ford secured the harness around James and signaled for lift. The boy rose slowly, limp and pale, boots dragging through the mud. Ford followed behind, barely able to hold onto the rope as the helicopters strained to hold them both. Halfway up, a downdraft slammed into the bird. The winch jerked. The cable swung them sideways. Ford's shoulder hit the rock wall. He bit down on a groan and tightened his grip around the boy. They rose again, inch by inch. At the door, Cadet Lee reached out, grabbed James's arm and pulled. Ford climbed in after, collapsed against the wall, gasping, hand pressed to the gash on his head. The cabin stank of sweat, smoke, and survival. James didn't stir. Then finally his eyelids twitched. He blinked, unfocused, slowly turned toward the man slumped beside him. Eyes cloudy, voice dry, almost a whisper. "You came. It's really you." Ford didn't smile. He just nodded and let the storm pass behind them. Morning broke in shades of gray, not light. The sun was somewhere behind the clouds, trying but failing to make its presence known. Rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. Trees stood like ghosts. The flight tower lights blinked steadily, red, then nothing, then red again. In the radar room, the screens were still. No blips, no signals, just static and silence. The base didn't move. No drills, no cadets running laps. The yard, usually full of shouting and sweat by now, was empty. Even the birds kept quiet. Inside the briefing room, Cadet Lee sat alone with an envelope in his hand. It was damp at the edges. He'd carried it through the storm. He hadn't opened it until now. He peeled it open slowly, like it might break in his hands. Inside, no medals, no mission report. Just a single folded sheet of paper, written in blocky ink. I don't fly for applause. I fly so no one has to wait in silence, wondering if help will ever come. If I'm late, it's not because I hesitated. It's because I was still trying. Lee's fingers tightened around the paper. Behind him, footsteps approached. Ryder stood in the doorway. His uniform was neat, but his eyes weren't. He didn't speak. Just looked at the letter for a long time, then slowly lowered his head. For the first time, there was no sarcasm, no command, only silence. Across the base, the flag stayed at half-mast. The dining hall never opened. The flight deck stayed locked. An entire day paused on one name, one signal lost just short of the finish line. Someone in the tower said it out loud around 7:15. He's gone. They didn't say it again. The radar tech leaned back in his chair, coffee untouched, the signal screen still blank, a day of stillness. And then, at 7:43, a noise. Low off rhythm, not clean, a chopper's beat but irregular like something limping across the sky. Heads turned, doors opened, eyes squinted into the fog. Out past the ridge a shape emerged, tilted, scarred, listing hard to one side. The bell 412. The right side was torn, one of the skids hung crooked, the belly was dented, the paint scorched, smoke trailed from the tail. It shouldn't have been in the air, but it was. The rotor groaned like old metal screaming. But it held, the nose dipped, corrected, landed hard. The whole airframe bounced once on the tarmac before settling into a shaky rest. And then silence. The door creaked open. Cadet Lee ran forward, followed by 3 medics. From inside, James Ray was lifted out first, pale but conscious, held up by his own breath and someone else's promise. Then Ford. His flight suit was soaked in blood and oil, one eye half shut, one arm limp at his side. He stepped out slowly, boots dragging. No drama, no speech, just a man who came back. Someone whispered, "How did he get through?" Another voice answered, "He didn't come back the way he left." The bell had circled south, through a mountain pass no one had flown in decades, a gap too narrow, too unstable, too suicidal, but he made it, because sometimes the only way back is through the place no one dares to look. 1 week later, Thunder Ridge stood under a clean sky. The storm had passed, and with it, the noise. The training field was quiet. No helicopters hovered overhead. No boots thundered across the grounds. Today was the end of a cycle, graduation day, but no one called it that. There were no speeches, no medals lined up on velvet, no talk of rankings or scores. There was only the ceremony, stripped down to its bones, simple, silent. Reverent, cadets stood in formation under the flagpole, eyes forward, boots polished, uniforms pressed. But something about the air felt heavier than usual. No one fidgeted. No one whispered. At the edge of the line, Cadet Lee stood with his hands behind his back, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. It had arrived that morning. No return address, no official stamp, just his name, neatly printed. He'd opened it in the dorm room, with no one else watching. Inside was a flight helmet, old, matte black, scuffed and weathered. It smelled faintly of sweat and jet fuel. On the inner lining, the initials HF were inked in faded marker. There was a note folded beneath it. Lee read it twice before the words finally sank in. "You only wear this when you know the sky is not for you, but for the ones you'll carry through it." He didn't cry, but he didn't breathe for a moment either. Across the field, riders stood with Commander West. Their posture was formal, but their eyes weren't. When Lee stepped forward and placed the helmet on a wooden mount beside the wall of honor, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The other cadets followed his gaze, and one by one, without command, they stood straighter. Then slowly they raised their hands, not to salute any flag or instructor, but to honor an empty space on the wall now holding something far heavier than metal. For the first time, the Academy gave silence not as a gap, but as gratitude. Ryder looked at West. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said quietly. West's voice was low. "That's because most men only fly for themselves." He didn't. Back in the infirmary, James Ray sat propped up on a thin mattress, leg in a cast, ribs taped. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened a small leather-bound journal. It was the one he'd carried since basic flight school. He'd never written in it, until now. The pen scratched against the paper. "I'm alive because someone didn't let me die with a promise unfulfilled." He paused, then wrote again. "Flying isn't just engines and charts. It's who comes for you when no one else will." He closed the book gently and stared out the window, watching the wind stir the trees. Outside, the Bell 412 sat under a tarp on the far side of the hangar. It wouldn't fly again. The damage was too deep, the cost too high, but no one touched it, no one dared move it. They called it the last flight. And on a plaque below the cockpit window, freshly carved, were 3 words: "For someone else." If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.